work session. Mr. Hamp, I think you're leading the charge this morning.
I'm leading the charge. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Public education and public safety. Any introductory presentation or summary explanation of the city manager's fiscal year 2019 recommended budget must leave the audience with the understanding that public education and public safety are the large and central themes of this budget. This is not to say that there is nothing else essential or important to the forward movement of the community or organization, but rather public education and public safety are where additional appropriation and position recommendations are most substantial. What are the drivers in public education this year? First, an increase in formula-based operating funds, nearly $240,000, providing meaningful benefit for general operation of Waynesboro's public schools. Second, an increase in appropriation to the debt service reserve for Waynesboro High School renovation project, drawing the city nearer to the forecasted $1.4 million needed when the project comes into full debt service. And finally, a recommended supplemental appropriation of $500,000 to provide for compensation increases in the Waynesboro public school system. In total, these budget components provide more than $1 billion new dollars for public education in fiscal year 2019. In public safety, drivers lie primarily this year in the fire and police departments and include, in the fire department, 3 new firefighter positions funded through reliance on a SAFER grant opportunity administered by FEMA. SAFER stands for Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response. If awarded, the grant will provide funding for 75% of the eligible wage and benefit costs for the initial 2 years of employment and 35% in the 3rd year. Localities are responsible for the balance of expense in the initial 3 years and assume full expense of the positions in year 4. The request for additional fire personnel originate from a staffing plan adopted in the 1990s, and the additional personnel improve suppression, tactical response, and the safety of fire personnel on the scene. I should note that if the department is unsuccessful in securing the grant, we will not endeavor to hire the individuals. Second, in the fire department, replacement of breathing apparatus. This essential equipment must be certified, and the current certification for equipment will expire in April of 2019. The department has been unsuccessful in previous attempts to secure grant funding for replacement. We will continue to attempt to secure grant funding. However, if unsuccessful, we must nevertheless purchase the equipment, and there are funds in the budget to accomplish that this year or in the ensuing fiscal year. In the police department, significant recommendations include funding for a sworn officer position, restoring a position frozen during the recession, funding for an animal control officer, which is a new or additional position supporting that function. Nearly 80% of animal control service calls are fulfilled by sworn or non-ACO personnel. The addition of this position actually creates capacity for the other patrol responsibilities. In-car computers and e-ticket equipment, which is being required by the state court system. 3 replacement vehicles in the police department. Continued support for career development supplemental compensation. Increases to support training and education in the department. Total increases from FY18 to fiscal year 19 in the fire and police departments exceed $870,000. It is noteworthy and justification for recommendations regarding employee compensation, training, and education that many departments are challenged to develop and retain sufficient employee base to provide anticipated supervision, management, and leadership demands occurring in the near future. In both the fire and police departments, the majority of individuals filling shift, divisional, and departmental command are presently eligible or will be eligible to retire within 5 years. Cultivating and retaining employees to fulfill those supervisory and command responsibilities is essential to ensuring the proper continuity of service. Further, adequate experience and training is essential for service delivery in the present and safety of emergency responders and law enforcement officers. Moreover, compensation and training are fundamental to employee development and retention and actually enhance service and reduce costs over the long term. Outside the public safety functions, employee development and retention are supported by prioritized development and compensation measures. The budget contains sufficient funds for a merit opportunity effective in mid-October, valued in aggregate in the general fund at 2%. It is important to note that increases will be tied to performance evaluation and will allow variable increase based on the employee's rating. This is a bold measure, but I suspect will be a welcome one among many participants and stakeholders. Employees and supervisors have, for the most part, embraced fundamental reform to our evaluation process, and many express openly a desire to tie more directly or connect more directly performance with pay. This budget seeks to preserve funds for training, as recommended by department directors. Sufficient training and development is important in non-public safety disciplines as well. Keeping in mind that public education and public safety are central to this budget, other elements warrant summary presentation and explanation. General fund position proposals. 4 positions in the street division of Public Works are recommended to establish a second concrete crew. The demand for curb and gutter, entrance, and sidewalk repair and maintenance far exceed the ability of the existing crew. The 4 positions are funded by VDOT urban maintenance funds and as such constitute a reallocation or reprioritization of maintenance resources. A parks maintenance technician who will assume primary support for park and recreation events, providing tables, trash receptacles, and other logistical support, preserving the ability and availability of grounds maintenance staff to accomplish mowing, trimming, and other maintenance functions. A financial manager in the Public Works Department, an administrative position shared by the Department of Emergency Management and Information Technology are also recommended. The administrative position was eliminated with the recession, and this is a restoration of that position in a shared model. With the exception of these 2 positions, all other recommended positions deliver service directly to the public. The budget increases reliance on contract services in the areas of park maintenance, mowing, and horticulture. It is increasingly difficult to retain adequate staff to accomplish all the seasonal mowing and maintenance duties, especially given that the city is increasing the number of facilities requiring care. In response, the Department of Parks and Recreation requested, and I am recommending, increased funding for contract services related to mowing and facility maintenance. This approach has been initiated in the current year and is recommended for expansion in the coming year. Each year, the recommended budget includes appropriation to repair and maintain facilities and to replace equipment and vehicles. The recommended budget is no different in that regard and proposes the use of some $846,000 of various reserves to repair and replace existing facilities or building components, replace existing or acquire new vehicles and equipment, acquire technology resources, and establish new facilities. The various recommendations and associated reserve reliance are detailed on pages 8.1 and 8.2 in the budget. The $846,000 equates to nearly 5 cents on the real estate rate, and the planned reliance on reserves probably varies between 3 and 6 cents over the previous 5 to 6 budget years. Having delivered a presentation and explanation of expenditures in the general fund at a summary level, there are revenue recommendations that warrant presentation as well. Significant revenue recommendations in the general fund include the following: a 6-cent increase in the real property tax rate, producing just over $1 million in new revenue. A 1% increase in the meals tax, which provides $685,000 in new revenue. And a 10-cent increase in the cigarette tax, which provides $165,000 in new revenue. Waynesboro's current real property tax rate is the 8th lowest according to a 2016 calculation and below the calculated median and mean for the 38 independent cities in Virginia. Waynesboro's current cigarette tax is among the lowest of cities who impose a cigarette tax. The water and sewer funds reflect a 3.1% and a 2.4% increase respectively, as recommended by the rate study completed last year. No matter the magnitude of challenge, budgets are an opportunity to confirm a plan and move forward, accomplishing important, beneficial, and sometimes difficult tasks for a community. This budget is balanced, and it addresses to a great extent the needs and priorities of public education and public safety. It attends to the staff and facilities that are vitally important to service delivery. It is aggressive in some areas and even bold in others, relying to an increasing extent on the private sector for service delivery, tying employee compensation to employee performance. The recommendations are informed and reasoned. A colleague observed that they felt like everyone would hate this budget. And I reflected on that and considered that perhaps I would disagree that everyone will hate this budget, but would say that everyone probably can find something to hate about the budget. I think a budget that is this well-reasoned, this well-prepared, and this responsive would be difficult to label as worthy of hatred or dislike. In the past, we began budget cycles with optimism, with seeing the ability or perhaps potential to move the organization and community forward, to accomplish important and vital things. And then by February, that optimism and potentiality gives way to practicality and necessity and reality. But at the conclusion, in my experience, with the benefit of the work of the department heads, the executive staff, the finance department, I think we've always delivered a sound and reasoned budget that attends to priorities and expectations, but does so in a manner that reflects and respects the economic climate in which we work. This will push the organization forward and the community forward. The real question becomes is to what extent these recommendations align with the expectations, ambitions, and preferences of the City Council. Mr. Shaw will give a more detailed presentation of the elements of the budget. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, good morning. What I'd like to try to do this morning is to give a high-level overview of major components of the budget as they change. And I'll concede that there's a danger in providing budgets by difference, so to speak. In other words, talking about the big changes, because it makes the assumption that the council is satisfied with the underlying budget as we began the season. So certainly there can be a conversation be had around the adequacies of levels of service and your expectations in the community and what it costs your community. But at any rate, what I intend to provide are those high-level themes to provide you what may be called an elevator speech. So if citizens ask you what's going on with the budget, why did Mr. Hamp recommend various tax rate increases and those sorts of things, that you will be prepared. And then at the end, we'll take a break and we'll receive questions, comments. We're certainly prepared to go through a departmental by departmental review if that's your preference. But at that point, the meeting essentially is yours, Mr. Mayor. I think at the end of the day, the hope is that we provide you with adequate information to make decisions and then to carry forward a conversation over the next several weeks as we try to adopt a budget. It's clearly a budget. It's got lots of numbers in it. And I think trying to make sense of it is the effort today. You know, I was looking through a document that was meant for local elected officials to provide some sort of financial background and guidance in adopting budgets. And one of the messages of the document was that the elected official doesn't need to know where every penny is in their budget. And that's why you have professional staff to develop and to ultimately monitor and manage a budget. But I think you do want to know whether or not the budget accomplishes the things in this community that you expect to accomplish. Are we going to be able to provide the levels of service that you expect in this community and pursue programs and projects that you have ambitions for this community? And then as well, do those programs, those projects, those levels of service match your perceived ability and willingness of the community to pay for those things? And so my hope would be that tends to be the focus as we go through the budget process this year. Can you point to the things that you hope to accomplish, and can you reconcile how much it's going to cost to accomplish those things? There was a theme that really came from the comprehensive plan, and that we also explored during the council retreat in December, and this theme of in some areas we have catching up to do, in some areas we are satisfied and we simply need to keep up, and in some areas we'd like to get ahead as a community. And I think you may recall that we went through an exercise with the council in the retreat where we talked about various areas of service delivery, whether it was public education, public safety, neighborhood protection, preservation, improvements. And we asked the council, where do you think we are on a spectrum of not doing so hot to doing, great? And then where would you like us to be? And in most cases, I think the council could come to some consensus about where we are, how we feel about our service delivery. And then in most cases, I think the council wanted to push us along to do better. There was some variation as to how much better and over what period of time. But I think it plays that theme that there are certainly areas where we have fallen behind, and it's going to cost something to catch up. And it may be improving staffing levels, it may be improving employee retention, or providing basic equipment and facilities that we need to operate. There are certainly areas where we feel satisfied with the current levels of service, and in some of those cases the budget will essentially stay the same, but in some cases it costs us money just to maintain the levels of service we have. In other words, you may have to purchase vehicles just to maintain the levels of service you have. We've been going through a lot of technology upgrades recently, and some of that was driven simply because of the age of our software and hardware. And I would say that the technology that we're getting is certainly better, and there are things that we can do with it that we weren't able to do with the former technology. But in terms of how we deliver service, it's much the same. The citizen won't see a lot of difference. There are certainly those areas that we want to get ahead, and I hear pretty consistently from the council that you want to pursue the expansion of parks and pursue the development of either the industrial park property or Sunset Park. And certainly, there are members of our staff. You have a police officer who feels like that they're short-staffed, and that they know that there are police officers in other jurisdictions making more money, and they'll look at us and they'll say, well, why are you spending money on greenways and parks and things like that? And the answer is simply that, one, sometimes we get grants to do those things that we can't use to pay police officers or other staff. And two, that as a community, we have to push ourselves forward if we want to be a community of choice and a community where values rise and where we attract business and industry who ultimately help fill the city coffers and keep us running as a business, and that allow us then to continue to offer the types of services that we're obligated to provide or that we want to provide. And I would say, though, that as you look through these, that not everything that we'll talk about will fit neatly into one of the three categories, but it's an interesting theme and a helpful theme in some ways to think about how we spend money. This year's general fund budget, that is the tax and fee supported budget, stands at just a little bit shy of $52 million. That reflects a $2.3 million increase over the FY18 budget, or about 4.5% increase. Over the last 10 years or so, the budget has increased from just a little bit less than $40 million to this year's proposed budget of almost $52 million. So there's been an average increase of about 3% a year. You'll see that there's kind of an anomaly where there's a peak there in 2015. And essentially what happened there was we refunded a bond issue, refinanced bonds essentially. And so what happens is you have a bank that gives you a bunch of money to pay off your bonds and another bank that expects that money back immediately. So you have an increase in both expenditures and your revenue. In terms of thinking about how we spend our money in the general fund, first off, about a little more than 40% of the revenues that we generate, that you levy as a council, goes to pay somebody else. And the biggest portion of that non-departmental $22 million is spent on the school system, that this year we're looking at about almost $16 million investment in public schools. But we also have a considerable payment to the Department of Social Services through the Comprehensive Services Act and the Virginia Public Service Act. There's a fair transfer to fund balance that the council set up a debt reserve for high school renovation in last year's budget, so there's a considerable contribution or transfer to that debt service reserve, and then as well, we pay about $2.8 million a year in debt. The single largest expenditure of the city's general fund is certainly public education, and as I say, we're approaching $16 million just in the operating cost of the school. That doesn't include what we might put into debt service or what we pay on existing debt on past renovations of educational facilities. And this is pretty typical of local government, that as you look across local governments in the Commonwealth, I think you would pretty uniformly find that public education is the single largest expenditure. Public safety, which would include the fire department, the police department, the operation of the Emergency Operations Center, and building inspections operation, costs the city about $10 million. And then next in line would be the general fund supported public works operations at about $5.8 million. Now, $4.1 million in the current year's budget as proposed actually comes through the Virginia Department of Transportation's urban maintenance program. That's both the annual allocation and then the use of restricted retained earnings of the city to operate this year. And as Mr. Hamp outlined, that in addition to the normal operation, the normal maintenance of streets and paving and operation of traffic signals and signs, those types of things, we're proposing to add a second concrete crew this year. And then as well, there's at least one large improvement project that will probably begin in FY18, and then certainly we would hope to continue into FY19, is the rehabilitation of the intersection at Delphine and East Main Street. In addition to the general fund public works operation, you have the landfill post-closure operation, and I'll detail there's some additional expenditures in landfill post-closure this year, the engineering department, and public works administration. As Mr. Hamp alluded, that public education is one of the biggest themes or central theme of this year's budget season. And funding for public education, the public school system here in Waynesboro, is proposed to increase by just over $1 million this year. Now, almost $240,000 of that $1 million comes by virtue of an increase in the funding formula, the operational funding formula that we have with the schools. I think at our last city council session, Dr. Castle mentioned that he's actually looking at almost $70,000 of new money from the city. The reason that I think he states it that way is because last year the council provided a supplemental funding to the schools in the amount of $171,000. So the funding formula is based on revenues from the most recent comprehensive annual financial report, which would have been for fiscal year 17. And that would increase the contribution to the schools by almost $240,000. However, I think we know that the money that we provided in supplement to last year's formula went to pay teachers. And so it's not like the year we did bleachers where it's a one-time funding. And so I think there's, that Dr. Castle assumes that the city would see that that's not part of the increase. In addition to that, last year the council set aside 5 cents in a debt reserve that was based on a tax rate increase, real estate tax rate increase. This year the budget sets aside an additional 2 cents from a tax rate increase. And this year a penny is valued at a little more than $175,000. So that's the debt service, additional debt service contribution of $350,630. And then finally, Mr. Hamp is recommending a $500,000 supplemental contribution to the schools. I think that, as Dr. Castle explained on Monday evening, that he believes that increasing teacher compensation is essential for the health and the future of the school system. But his current budget doesn't have any sort of teacher compensation increase, and so this supplement, we assume, would be used for teacher compensation. I think one thing that I would say as we look at this is that the funding formula as we know it doesn't really work anymore. As we start to move beyond this year's budget and you consider that by fiscal year 20, that the revenues that you are generating from tax rate increases is going to be going to debt service. And so if it's part of the funding formula, the schools get 42.5% of that, and you won't be able to make debt service in the way that we've conceived it. And as well, that when we're providing these supplements that we know are going to contribute to ongoing cost, we can't very well retract those without the expectation that Dr. Castle would have to make dramatic decreases to his staffing or to some other part of his operation. And so I raised the issue today to say that by this time next year, we have to have rethought what we're doing with that funding formula, both to preserve the ability for the city to make debt service and for the school system to operate as they would hope.
Mr. Shaw, can I ask you a question now?
Sure.
I know we've talked about like the penny we give them last year that was just for the raise. And that was a one-time only thing. And like you said, Council seems to think it's in the budget now, that it's going to stay there from last year to this year. But we talked about, I think me and you've had the conversation, that penny's not dedicated for them again this year, correct?
That's essentially, yes. That's why we present that the increase by formula is $240,000, because we just look at the increased revenue that we received in 2017 above what we received in 2016, and that's the basis of the formula.
So that would make up the difference for them to have the funds to keep up with that 1 cent.
That is correct, yes.
So that 1 cent actually is back with us now this year. I mean,
it's the money we generate this year.
That we generate, that we're not planning on giving them again. So it should be another penny we have here for us in our budget.
That is correct.
Okay.
Now, the thing that I would caution, though, one is simply that by the time we get to, again, 2021 will be the year that we're taking revenues from 2019 and giving them 42.5% of whatever those revenues, so it will diminish. And then two, that had the revenues of the city not increased in 2017 and it was completely flat, that would have meant that the schools would have gotten exactly what they got last year, less $171,000. So if the revenues of the city had been completely flat in 2017, then Dr. Castle would be in a lurch to either find money in his own budget or that $170,000 you gave him last year, or come up with, or ask the city for another supplement of equal value. And I think that therein, I know this is confusing for a lot of folks, that we base our funding formula on revenues that are essentially generated 2 budget years back, because we base it on the most current CAFR. The most current CAFR for FY19's budget is FY17. So as this thing moves forward, you're going to start to find that, one, that either you're going to have to keep more than 42.5%, or you have to keep raising taxes to pay off that debt service, or to pay to equal the supplements that you've already given.
Well, I know that sometimes I'm extremely hard in trying to understand what's happening, and it seems like we go in circles sometimes. But if Mr. Hamp would say, all right, I want to have a 3-cent tax increase this year, that we're going to actually raise it up 3 cents. Well, in my mind, we still got that penny that we raised last year that we put into the schools. That's now coming back to us that we hadn't planned in our budget last year because it went directly to the schools. So if we do a 3-cent tax increase this year, per se, plus we get the penny back from the school that we had last year, in my mind, that equals to a 4-cent increase in our budget that we didn't have last year. So if we hadn't have put that penny in there last year, we might as well be asking for a 4-cent tax increase this year. Is that right?
That's about right. I mean, if all other things
that's how I'm trying to understand.
If all other things were equal, and all other things aren't equal. In other words, there's a pretty dramatic drop this year in personal property tax, and so. But if all other things were equal, that's correct.
The $500,000 supplemental, is that, once that's done, what does that do when I won't be around? What does that do to the next budget?
That's where I'm saying I think that the expectation of the school is that that money will be there again. Now, it could be that revenues in FY18 increase enough to cover it, but I don't think they will. I don't see an indication from the numbers we see so far that says revenues are going to increase sufficient to cover $500,000. Now, again, there was a tax rate increase in FY 17 or 18 that would increases revenues to some extent, but we committed to the taxpayer that we were going to set 5 cents of that aside for debt service. So, this. I raised the issue not to resolve it today, but to say by the time we're sitting here next year, God willing, that we're going to be talking a lot differently about school funding and the funding formula. And I would say that conversation needs to start with the school board pretty quickly.
And like last year when we put the money aside just for the funding for the capital improvement at the high school, we made it very clear then that won't work into the formula.
Right.
That was just designated straight for the payment of the capital improvement. Have we ever had a conversation at all about, like, when we give money just for raises? Because that's an ongoing, that's not going to go away. And if we give a 1 or 2 cent tax increase this year that just went to cover cost of raises, that would also be eliminated from the formula. Because, as you say, down the road, we're going to have to say, well, now the formula says you're going to get 42.5% of this, but then we'd have to make up that money somewhere else because
right.
the raises are there and they're not going away. So, maybe we plant that seed now. Is that somehow to remodel, rework our formula
right.
to distinguish what goes into it and what doesn't?
Well, yes. And, I remember reading at some point in time reasons that a community might revisit funding formula with schools. Because the funding formulas are fairly common. They're, I think, a good way to operate in many ways because they provide some certainty to the administrators who have to assemble these budgets and bring them to elected officials. And so it sets expectations at all levels. But the reasons that you might revisit funding formulas are changes in the economy. Bearing in mind that we established the funding formula in 2006, prior to a recession, changes in the school population, and we've heard at great length about changes in our school population, changes in debt service, and taking on a $20 million project certainly changes the equation. But there were really quite a number of reasons why you might revisit a funding formula, changes in compensation. As I looked through it, I thought, well, gosh, the 10 reasons you might revisit your funding formula, we've hit 8 of them. And so I think it's time. Again, I personally, as an administrator, appreciate the funding formula for its certainty it provides, and it sets expectations. But to your point, Mayor Allen, with the debt service, I think you may recall that years ago, the council and the schools entered into an agreement about Kate Collins' debt service funding. And part of that was based on getting proceeds from the Commonwealth that no longer exist. And so when we look at a portion of that Kate Collins debt service, we actually take that off the top of the discretionary revenues. And so it's a similar arrangement, I think, with the high school debt.
I'll just echo Mayor Allen. I think you've captured the sort of sentiment. I would also offer just an observation, just in 2 years now of watching Dr. Castle's budget presentation, is that and I would ask the community to sort of just acknowledge this, that the state and federal government put more and more requirements of additional resources that need to go to kids. And I'm not saying that they're bad, but they provide zero contribution, near zero contribution for that. And so some of this cost and the deviation from a fixed formula, we're seeing the kind of consequence of that is that we're being forced what to do, and adapt with standards, but no financial resources coming from any other entity. So the proverbial phrase of it rolls downhill, right? So here we are.
Well, I think you're exactly right, and the experience we had just as we were coming out of the recession was actually the Commonwealth pulled back a lot of funding for public schools, and it was unrealistic to think that local governments could quickly make up the difference, because we were also finding shortages in the compensation that we receive for police officers and any number of other things.
The 42.5% has probably run its course, and it's did well in the past. Can you give us an idea of what the average is around the state? Is there
I really can't. What I would say just off the cuff is that 42.5% is a relatively generous percentage, but it's based on revenues, and so the revenue picture for localities is so different,
right,
that if you're talking about Fredericksburg, it's sure quite different than it is in Waynesboro. So it's a lot about, 42.5% of what? And so as a percentage, that's pretty generous, but it's really, at the end of the day, 42.5% of what? Because some localities generate more and some localities generate less revenues than we do. Continuing with the theme, that as you're well aware, in 2018, the fiscal year 2018, Council raised the real estate tax rate by 6 cents. 7 cents. 5 cents of that was to be dedicated entirely for high school debt service, and so we established a debt service reserve. The initial contribution in the debt service reserve was about $835,000. Now, a lot of that has been spent because there was we spent money purchasing properties, and we spent money on the architectural engineering firm that's charged with coming up with the design for the high school. And so there's not a lot left of that initial debt service reserve. We assume that the council will want to continue that contribution. This year, the value of a penny is just a bit higher. It was about $171,000 last year, a little more than $175,000 this year. So last year's 5 cents will equate to about $877,000. Then in the current year budget, we're proposing to set an additional 2 pennies into the debt reserve, which would be a little more than $350,000. And so the total FY19 transfer to the debt service reserve would be a bit more than $1.2 million. We expect that once the debt service comes online for the high school renovation, the $21,500,000 that the council has authorized borrowing, that the annual debt service will be around $1.4 million. In fiscal year 19, however, we'll only have one payment, and that will be a little more than $630,000. So if you were to stick to the plan as proposed by Mr. Hamp's budget, there would be additional money in this debt service reserve. My recommendation would be to move forward with that plan because, by next year we will have a decision as to whether you can support the debt service without a tax rate increase, or whether you need another small tax rate increase, or whether you can buy yourself some time if you don't touch the debt service reserve otherwise, to say, well, this year we're going to pull some money out of the debt service reserve to cover that little bit of additional money. And so, nothing certain here. I understand, except death and taxes. No, but I think setting it up this way gives you a little latitude in the next year's budget, maybe a budget after that. Continuing with a theme, and Mr. Hamp outlined really a fair amount of detail as to what the increases in the police department, fire department would pay for. But as a sum, the police department's budget goes up by almost $570,000. The fire department's budget is proposed to go up by about $303,000. I would note that in the police department, a big chunk of that money is in wages and benefits. About $420,000 of those dollars are in wages and benefits. And in addition to the new positions that the chief has asked for, animal control officer, and then to backfill a position that was frozen during our session, that was a police investigator position, that in FY18, the council added 4 new positions in the patrol division, but 2 of them were held until January. And so this year, you're seeing an increase because of the total. You have to pick up the total cost of those additional positions, as well as a crime analyst position that was added during the fiscal year when there was a transfer made to create a part-time position and move IT resources back over to Gary Choate's division. And then as well, as Mr. Hamp alludes to, we're proposing that there would be a merit-based opportunity for across-the-board wage increases. And so that's built into the budget.
When you say there's a merit across the board?
Well, the way it works is we've calculated what a 2.5% increase would cost the city through the general fund as a total and in the enterprises. However, it's merit-based, so it doesn't mean everybody gets 2%. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. I've got a slide that talks about a pay-for-performance program. But when we did the calculation, we said, well, let's do it across the board. So you essentially have a pool of money to work with to give raises. In the fire department, as Mr. Hamp has discussed, we're proposing that we would add 3 additional firefighter positions. However, in the current fiscal year, we would only pick up a quarter of the cost of those firefighters because the hope would be that the rest of their salaries would be grant funded. And I would say that, since I've been in this position, Chief Scott, before Chief Bradley, now Chief Bradley, have come to this, and they make very cogent arguments about why they need actually 6 new firefighter positions. A lot of it has to do with how you man a fire scene. And certainly our fire department responds to probably more calls for service for emergency medical, but when you have a fire scene, there's a way of providing service based on the equipment that has to be deployed to that scene. And without getting into a lot of complication, there's a protocol that exists at the Emergency Operations Center that says for whatever call comes in, here's how resources are dispatched to that, whether they be resources of the fire department, police department, or the Waynesboro Rescue Squad. And so based on whatever that scene entails, then there's equipment and personnel that have to be dispatched. And there are certain types of fire scenes, especially, where we feel like we're under-deployed. The other element, and this is a growing theme in all of the public safety as well as public works divisions, is that we operate often short-staffed. And so what ends up happening is that you just simply don't have enough, at our current staffing levels, we're short in being able to deploy resources.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
When we talk about short staffing, and I know in the police department, I think we still have a pretty healthy reserve police force, and they work hard to try to keep that field.
Yeah.
Where we stand at with the fire department volunteers, because I know over the years, things have changed, the requirements to be a volunteer, the training has increased, right. And so, but do we still?
Well, I'll ask Chief Bradley to correct me if I misstate this. I think what you would find is that we have some pretty solid volunteers, but they don't do a whole lot, if anything, on fire response or in medical response teams. That they do a lot to help us raise funds or certain things that we were able to do that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. We didn't have the resources that the volunteers provide to us. But that I don't think there are a whole lot of volunteers that currently are responding to fire incidents.
We have about 8 that are active, and they come to structure fires when they're available. But trying to recruit new ones is very difficult. As a national, pretty much a national theme, volunteerism is going significantly downhill, and due to the training requirements and hours and trying to keep up with everything, and people in today's society with their busy lives just don't have the time to dedicate to volunteer that they used to.
I do think that, Augusta County is a cautionary example locally that, it's hard to believe, but that I can remember in my career a time when Augusta County was almost virtually 100% of, supported by volunteers. And over a period of time, they've added 100 paid staff in Augusta County in literally about a 10-year period. And so I think that's, as Chief Bradley alludes to, a common theme, less and less availability of those folks to really make a big difference in your staffing.
Well, I'm old school, and I'm used to when we had an extremely large volunteer, I don't know at what time, but we probably had more volunteers than we did paid people back in the day. But when you talk about the grant money also, that'll pay a big percentage of the 3 new that you've proposed, how long would that grant money be available? Because I know we hear now that Augusta County is having where the grants
you get 3 years out of that?
You get 2 years at 75%, and the third year is 35%. And in year 4, the locality assumes full financial responsibility for the positions.
Yeah, I think if you, as a council, decide, yes, we need to improve staffing in the fire department, that we're taking advantage of a stopgap measure, and that they will come to pay the piper. Another big expenditure in the fire department, really the biggest single one, is that the breathing apparatus that the fire department use are set to expire. And so they expire in April of 2019. And so some of that breathing apparatus is pretty interchangeable, but the masks that are issued to firemen, but they have to be compatible with the breathing apparatus, the tank itself. And so the cost of replacement is about $238,000. And we've tried on a couple of occasions to get grants to pay for that, and we'll try again this fall. And if we get it, then you have a windfall in your budget, and if we don't, then we've prepared ourselves to replace that. That is, we do consider that a capital outlay, and we are proposing in the budget that be paid for from some of your committed reserves. The general fund supported portion of Public Works is proposed to increase by about $665,000. As I alluded to earlier, about more than $300,000 of that really is in the Streets Division. And so revenues match expenditures in the Streets Division. It doesn't have an impact on the tax rate or the budget generally, because we do have some increase this year, I think about $58,000 increase in the contribution we're receiving from VDOT. And then the remainder of that $302,000 is simply a transfer from the VDOT committed reserves to the Streets Division. So there's an offset. Expenditures are offset by revenues. We do propose some increase in the non-VDOT allowed streets maintenance, about $55,000. And I can tell you from conversations that I have with Public Works Division, and I can tell you by looking at our own system of pavement management and inspection, that's not nearly enough. That the request that we received was a couple of $100,000 more than that to pave streets that are not in the VDOT system. We've been through a period of years where we keep asking VDOT to add some of the older streets to the system, and it's a process of going out and demonstrating that they are wide enough, both street and right-of-way width, to be eligible for VDOT urban maintenance. So we've continued, and I think we've had some success in doing that, but you still have a fair number of streets in the city, and mostly in the old basic city portion of the city, that were just never built to current standard, and that those streets tend to erode. The challenge that we have with streets every place is that if they erode beyond a certain level of quality, then they become much more expensive to fix. That you see every year we do a process where we mill and the top layer of asphalt off streets and then put a new cover on it. And as long as we can do that, great. But as the streets deteriorate to the base level, then the cost to fix those streets quadruples. And so, and we do have a system. And I say this now as a precursor to spring paving, that we evaluate all of our streets through a pavement management system, that all of the streets essentially are videoed. We have a camera truck that goes around. This is a contract service with a van. And then you get images of your streets, and they're put through an evaluation for different types of street deterioration. And so all of the streets then are rated by segments, and that our goal is that they don't fall below a certain rating. And so what ends up happening is also we factor in how much traffic the street receives, what is the construction of the street itself. In other words, a street like Delphine or Rosser Avenue are constructed at a different standard than Forest Drive or Crompton Road. And so So our effort is to address streets to try to maintain a minimum level of standard. And so, and as we get to spring paving, we'll certainly release the list of streets to be worked on this year.
Joe, of the $665,000, how much of that has to be provided by local funds?
About half of it, a little more than half. That we have a proposal in the landfill post-closure to upgrade the gas extraction system. That's about $137,000. That would be in advance of Sunset Park development that I think you may recall from presentations that we have parts of the gas extraction system that are above ground and that they would have to be below ground or flush with the ground to meet the standard that the Department of Environmental Quality would require and that our insurer would require. Then we've also have some additional money there to engineer and design related to the recycling center. I think as we went through the process, we recognized that the recycling center in its current configuration and operation didn't really present the best entrance to the park or entrance that we perhaps hoped for. And then as well, there's some additional ground watering cost at the landfill that, as you're aware, there's a plume of contaminated groundwater that moves primarily to the north of the landfill. And so there's going to be some additional costs this year related to groundwater monitoring. And then in the Public Works Administration side, we're proposing, as Mr. Hamp mentioned, a financial manager. The Public Works Division, of course, operates the multiple enterprises as well as the Streets Division. And it is our feeling that there is sufficient demand there to have somebody that's essentially a bookkeeper, financial manager within the division itself. And this, at one time, there was an assistant public works director, and we have made this proposal as well in the past. Now, having said that, we reflect this, that the cost of that person's salary, about $70,000, $73,000 with wages and benefits, entirely in the general fund. But the reality is that there's a cost allocation so that each of the enterprises pays a portion of that salary. So there's an interfund transfer that comes back over from the sewer fund, the water fund, stormwater fund, refuse fund, and there's a charge to VDOT to pay for that person's salary for the most part. And then there were some smaller expenditures. We're in a position where the certification on the Jones Hollow Dam will expire, and so we have about $20,000 to $30,000 plugged in. That's for a firm to evaluate the dam structure and the condition of the pond and spillway for recertification. And then as well, the Headwaters Soil and Conservation District has asked for an additional contribution of about $23,000 as a contribution to a dam technician that we would share with Augusta County. I think Augusta pays 3/4 of the salary and benefits, and we would pay 1/4 of the salary and benefits.
When you go back to that bookkeeper's position, or whatever how'd you title it?
Financial manager.
Yeah, I think
Financial
manager, yes.
And what's their duties will be?
Give me just a second. I can give you essentially, that person would be responsible to ensure that invoicing and purchasing in the division is properly handled. I think one of the concerns that we had once we entered into the Munis system is that we have a lot of folks in public works that touch our financial system. You have crew leaders and general supervisors who are entering requisitions for purchasing and paying invoices and that sort of thing that really aren't within their job descriptions. And the Munis folks really made comment about how many people we have in public works that touch the financial system. And that in a lot of places, you have folks that are simply going to somebody and saying, here's what I need. That person is doing the requisition for purchasing, and as supplies come in, they say, here are the tickets for receipt, and another person is managing essentially the bookkeeping. In addition, that person would be responsible for budget entry and management. That's, again, a effort that's spread over a lot of different folks now. The person would assist the director in budgetary reports that are provided to either the administration or the council, would oversee the creation, submission of requests and expenditure reports for the federal, state, and private cost-sharing projects that we work on, and seek reimbursement or accountability for those. A lot of those would either be the grantors that we deal with through Public Works, or even the bond reimbursements that we look for. Oversee the reconciliation and processing of P cards. That's what we call a credit card in our system. Oversees processing of accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, purchasing, inventory for the enterprise and general funds. Oversees expenditure requests from employees, acts as a liaison to the finance department, acts as a liaison to the Office of the Treasurer regarding all utility billing and collection and processing, provides training on the use of field purchase orders, city forms, Kronos, which is the timekeeping system, Munis, and other financial related softwares, receives and maintains bonds for public utilities, erosion sediment control, landscaping, oversees the financial activities of the utility billing department, and other tasks as assigned.
Who's doing all these tasks now?
It's really either one is they're not getting done, and they fall back sometimes to the finance department, who can be frustrated because they're coming into it sort of late in the game, and essentially trying to figure out what's already happened. Or two, that they're distributed over really a pretty wide number of people that aren't trained in many cases in their job descriptions, don't require them to have either the computer skills or the accounting skills to handle the things that we're asking them to do. And it's a conversation I've had with Mr. McReynolds, is that, again, you have a general supervisor, and you look at his job description, and it says that he has to be familiar with, waterworks or wastewater works, and the basic, for lack of a better word, plumbing and engineering that goes with that stuff, and be able to manage a crew of men, all those kinds of things. But there's nothing in that job description that says, and has to be computer literate and has to be able to do basic accounting, the math that goes to basic accounting. And so what ends up happening is that those things end up in somebody else's hands. Sometimes they do a good enough job, and sometimes we're just trying to fix problems as they've existed. And so I think this is trying to clean that up and streamline that process.
I think we'll work on this position more down the road.
So is this one more cost effective than just training the people to take on those tasks?
Well, I would say yes. And part of why I would say that is that, one, is that, as I'm going to show you in a minute, turnover is a big problem in public works. And so the people that sometimes this falls to, I would just soon be there supervising field crews as sitting around and learn how to use a computer system. And two, part of it has to do with how we describe a job to somebody who's eligible for the job. And so if we take these same employees and say, in addition to the things you have to be able to do to be a utility worker, now you also have to have some level of computer skills and accounting skills, then that person, we don't have that person anymore. You don't have that job, doesn't work anymore, unless you're willing to elevate those jobs and say that you're going to concede that a bigger portion of their job is going to be processing invoices than working with their crews in the field. And it doesn't really make sense as a utility operation. You really want those people in the field working with their crews and not trying to figure out how to purchase pipe and pay for it. I think a couple of other notable increases The Information Technology Division shows a net increase of $87,532. Primarily, that's because right now we're working in two enterprise resource planning software systems. The HTE system is the legacy system, and we continue to pay a six-figure maintenance fee on that system until we've completely worked out of it. But we've got enough of the Munis financial system online that now we're getting hit with 100% of the maintenance on that system. And so this is something that eventually will come down. The real increase is more than six figures. But Mr. Choate was able to cut some other things in his budget, so the net increase is about $90,000. As Mr. Hamp alluded to, the Parks and Recreation Department's budget goes up by about $232,000, almost $233,000. There's a portion of that that is related to parks maintenance, the parks maintenance technician's position, contract services for maintenance of landscaping in certain areas, mowing medians, those kinds of things, parks maintenance generally. But I would also point out that in the way that our budget is configured, building maintenance falls on the Parks Division. So there's some pretty extraordinary building maintenance costs. There's a cooling tower at the Gorsuch building that needs replacement, and that's about $100,000. The EFIS, which is essentially what looks like a lot of people call stucco, at the Rosenwald building needs to be refurbished, and that's about $60,000. The reason there is we wanted to refinish the basketball court at Rosenwald. We had a company that came in to refinish that floor. They do certain tests and said the humidity in here is too high. You have water that's getting in the building, and that it doesn't make any sense for us to try to refinish these floors because you're going to continue to have warping and deterioration of the floor with the humidity as it is. Thus, we look to a $60,000 solution to secure the building. There are a couple of items in the Parks Division that I might note. One is about $30,000 to build permanent restrooms along the Greenway and the Loth Springs area where we currently have porta-johns. And I would consider that kind of a getting ahead project. We hope to have a partnership to refurbish the wall and steps at the Plum House, but we've put $15,000 in our budget for that. Another increase this year, a six-figure increase, is from the Department of Social Services. Our contribution to the Virginia Public Assistance Act and the Comprehensive Services Act programs at DSS increased by about $100,000. As we've mentioned, that we would like to provide a merit-based employee pay increase. The way that we budget this is that we figured out what a 2% across-the-board increase would cost the city if we were to begin it in October for all full-time classified employees and make them eligible for a merit-based increase. Essentially, the way it would work, though, would be that, one, we would base the increase on our annual performance evaluation. That over the last couple of years, we've moved the entire city to a graded performance evaluation program. And what happens is that employees sit down with their supervisors and managers and establish goals for the employee for that year, and then they're graded on their performance through the year, and then finally at their next review period, they're given a grade on the various areas, goal areas of their individual evaluation, and that gives an overall score for the employee. And so, and the scoring works that if you receive a 5, it means that you have significantly exceeded expectations. I can tell you that in the organization there may be 10 or a dozen people that I've seen that get a 5. In some cases, there's a person who may get a 5 because they had extraordinary duties one year that they're not going to have the next year, and it's going to be a lot tougher to maintain that 5. A 4 means that you're exceeding expectations. You're doing better than we would expect. 3 means that you meet expectations. You've done what we've asked of you. And then below that, at 2, you're meeting some expectations, which would generally mean you're headed to some sort of an improvement plan, what we call a documented improvement plan. And then a 1 means you're not meeting expectations, and we probably won't see you next year at evaluation time. So as we looked at how we might create, use the 2%, the pool of money that would be available, then part of what we're trying to do is reward the effort and to more quickly move people along in their pay range. So for every position in the city, there's a grade assigned to that position, that we go through a process of evaluating the position itself in terms of the professional accreditations, the education that's required for the position, the difficulty of the position, the working conditions of the position, how many people the position supervises, and the decision skills required for the position, and the decision impact of the position. In other words, has either somebody that operates within their realm, and their decisions, as long as they're not goofy, basically get the job done, versus somebody, Mr. Hamp, for instance, whose decisions have wide-ranging impact on the organization. So then each of those positions gets a pay scale, a beginning and an ending salary for that position. So as you look at these quartiles, and I'm going to simplify things here, think of the quartiles as I took my pay scale, the range for that employee, and broke it into quarters. So if the pay scale ran from $30,000 at an entry and $40,000 it maxes out, the first quartile is from $30,000 to $32,500. The second quartile starts at $32,501 and runs to $35,000, which would be the midpoint for the range. The third quartile would run them from $35,001 to $37,250, and then finally from $37,251 to $40,000 as the fourth quartile. Most organizations would hope that somebody can meet their mid-range somewhere in the 8 to 14 year time period. Because by the mid-range, what you're saying is that employee is more than adequately trained. They have all the experience necessary to perform the job and can do it independently. And so obviously some people are going to get there earlier than others, but it shouldn't be, we don't have a step system like the schools where you're just marking time. You're supposed to accelerate fairly early in your career, and then it usually takes somewhat longer, but you're also figuring your salaries are higher by the time you're in that third and fourth quartile, and so a 2% raise means is a lot different than the guy who's in the first quartile. So the notion would be that you want to move people through their first and second quartiles more rapidly. That currently, and this is, we have run the numbers for our individual employee group. So currently, 71% of our employees rest in that first and second quartile. Now, some of that is because of turnover, and some of it is because we have been fairly stagnant in our ability to give people raises, and so that people, even if they've been with us a while, aren't moving along very quickly through the quartiles. So the system that we've proposed would be that there's a blending between what your evaluation score is and then where are you in your quartiles. So you can see that if, for instance, the person who's meeting expectations, the good old employee does everything you tell them to do, and you're happy with them, but not much else. I mean, that they're not exceeding your expectation. That in their first quartile, they would be eligible for a 3% increase. But by the time they get to the second, it's a 2% increase. And by the time they move to the third quartile of their pay range, they're dropping down to 1.5%. And then likewise, that if somebody significantly exceeds expectations and they're fairly new in the organization, they'd be eligible for as much as a 5% raise. And part of what you're trying to do is take that employee and capture them. You want to retain that employee, and you want to reward them early enough in their career that they become more and more committed to the city. And then likewise, as you know, if you have that high achieving employee, if they've moved along in their pay range, that again, that percentage at 3% or 2.5% should be more valuable than if they were in the beginning of their pay range. So it starts to scale down. So there's two factors in the matrix that make the system, we think, work. Is that one is that you're basing this on the specific annual evaluation of the employee, and then you're creating a factor for where are they in their pay scale, and that our effort is to accelerate people more quickly to their midpoint. Employees that would not qualify for merit increases would be any employees that have reached the maximum of their range, and this is something we have sometimes tough conversations about, that once you get to a certain value, you've hit the top of your range, the position simply doesn't warrant that you would have, that you would be infinitely valuable in any position in the city. And then two, that employees that have a rating of 2.5 or lower would not be eligible for an increase in the system.
Does this cover full-time and part-time staff?
It does not. It covers full-time classified employees.
Okay.
Department heads?
Department heads would be included. Yes, they're classified employees. Mr. Hamp is not a classified employee. There are several, Ms. Bortle, your charter officials, constitutionals are not classified employees.
Who makes these evaluations?
Evaluations are made by the direct supervisor, and depending on how large the department head or the department is, it may be several layers of supervision that oversee this. So what we do to try, and what we've done for the last couple of years to try to make the system honest, so to speak, is that you have department heads and supervisors who have familiarity with their peers and the work of some of their colleagues, employees, and they come together and we go through a calibration process. So we sit down and we say, okay, the water division superintendent pretty much knows what's over in the sewer division. And they sit down and the water division guy says, I'm going to give Joe a 5 this year. And the sewer division guy says, that's insane. Joe comes to work late and, Joe didn't do this, Joe didn't do that. Joe's worth a 3, and they come to a calibration. And so that, as we sit down at director level even, I think we've come to fairly consistent agreement about the grading of employees. In other words, there's enough understanding, knowledge of other folks' employees to say, yeah, that person really is a 5. There's no doubt that they stand out. Everybody knows it. Or, no, they're really, really good, but not a 5. There's only a couple of 5s. I mean, there are only a few people any particular year that can hit that. And that most people are 3s. I mean, most people do, that we have in our employee, do what's asked of them and do it in a way that we say, yeah, they're meeting our expectations. They deserve a raise. So that's, I guess the answer to your question is that it's the department. Depending on the structure of the department, it's either a direct supervisor or a department head, and oftentimes, combination of the two. I think one of the reasons that we're proposing this is because when we move to the type of system that we have now, a graded system, there were a number of department heads that say, what's the reward at the end of this? If you grade people and then you tell them there's no reward, everybody gets the same raise or no raise at all, then it undermines the integrity of the system. Why grade people? I think there are reasons that you could make, or arguments you can make as to why you would do it, but they make a good point, is that if you're going to grade people, then what is the payoff? I think the other element of this is that we recognize that employee retention and employee attraction is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge, not only for the city of Waynesboro, but employers generally. I hear this in the public sector and in the private sector here locally, that the competition for employees has gotten to be much more intense. We have a very low unemployment rate in the area. And the culture of employees have gotten to be where they're more willing to move. That the idea that you would go to work for a company and stick with that company until you got a pension and a gold watch is really a thing of the past. For one thing, there's not that many pensions. Even the Virginia retirement system's pension system is become a blend of a defined pension and a defined contribution. So, but that creates a big challenge for us, and I see it in virtually all of the areas where you're either running short-staffed, which puts added stress and frustration on the people that are there, and they start to think, golly, Ned, is this really worth it? I mean, I look at public safety, and virtually every day there's calls going out. Can somebody help cover a shift? Can somebody help cover a shift? In public works, we have a constant vacancy rate. In other words, I can't remember the last time we were at full staff in public works. And it shows up when you go to move snow, and when basically, why does it take so long to do things? Well, we're short-staffed. So I show you these turnover rates, and essentially, if most companies would like their turnover to be somewhere between about 5 and 10%. That you expect that there's some natural turnover. People retire, people find new jobs, people have life changes, that they're going to leave you. But once you start to get above that 10%, and as you can see in some areas we've certainly operated well above 10%, that that turnover starts to cost you in terms of real dollars. It costs money to train and recruit new people, and you lose the training that you've invested in people who walk out the door. You lose efficiency, and it costs you in terms of productivity. And so I think pay is one of the things that goes into attracting and retaining employees, and I think especially a merit-based pay system could help in terms of retaining employees. But I think we'd have to concede that there are other factors, that once somebody has figured out that, okay, this job pays enough for me, over a period of time, pay becomes maintenance. And every time you get a raise, you feel good for about 2 or 3 paychecks, and then most people pretty quickly figure out how to spend the extra money they've gotten, and now it's maintenance. Nonetheless, you can't ignore pay. It is a factor in attracting folks, and especially if you look around and say, well, I can do the same job in this area for more money, then I'll go do it. And that's especially the case if you take like firefighters who work 24-hour shifts, that it makes more sense for them to drive from some distance. We've got a firefighter that drives from McGaheysville, because once they get there, they're here 24 hours. If they can trade shifts with somebody, they might be here 48 hours. They stay here 2 days, and then they drive home. And when they're off 4 days at a stretch. So it's not just what Augusta County is paying, it's wherever the guy in McGaheysville can work. And so we see more and more of that, or you see guys in Augusta County in the Waynesboro area that say, I'll go work in Richmond or Fairfax or whatever. And so we get ourselves hung up on what is Augusta County and Stanton paying, but they aren't the only competitors for some of these jobs.
How do we rate with other jurisdictions? Do they have the same amount of turnover, or do we have those statistics?
I'd be slow to tell you that I know what those statistics are. All I know is that our rate is too high. I mean, I would say that, clearly our rate is too high, but I couldn't tell you with any certainty.
If we looked at all, let's say 80% of other localities equal to us are too high. And, I watch some of the local plants here that seem to be advertising in the newspaper for months and months and months. And they're, not bad entry-level pay, but I hear stories that, well, they showed up and worked one shift and didn't come back, or they worked 2 weeks or 2 months. And I mean, I realize what you're saying, and I realize pay's part of it, and we need to do things, but are we trying to fix a problem that's outside of the locality part of it and just in general? Or
it's like a lot of things, you control what you control. And I can't tell you what, for instance, Stanton or Augusta County's turnover is. I can tell you they're working harder to retain people than we are. I mean, that's the thing, that if you start to look around and say, well, yeah, but we start to fall at the bottom of not only pay, but then what else goes in, to that job. Training is important for a lot of employees. I think for your best employees, training and a hope of advancement is, a motivating thing. I think, the appreciation that we can show employees outside of pay. And I think adequate staffing, again, if people are constantly frustrated that they show up to work and they realize, we're short-staffed, we don't have enough of us to go around, that wears on you over time. I think leadership at all levels, leadership at our level, leadership at the supervisor's level, leadership throughout the organization is a big thing. And I think you have to, in an organization our size, try to cultivate that level. Oftentimes, people look at their boss and they say, I either going to work for this guy and I'll be loyal because of my boss, then, that's a huge factor. And so I think, we want to be able to encourage not only that entry-level employee, but people who can be leaders in our organization and give them reasons to stay with us.
Do we keep track of the percentage of these people who are leaving? They're leaving within a 6 months' time or a year's time, and this is not like a 2-year, 3-year.
We do have that information.
Okay.
You can look at every employee and see how long they were with us and see what their, we try to do exit interviews with folks to see why they left and those types of things. That's not mandatory. Okay. And I think it varies. I think in some areas, and especially I look at public works, for instance, it may be getting to be less and less the case, but, at public works, there was a period of time, and I would look at certainly fiscal year 15, 16, maybe even some of 17, and a fair amount of that turnover is because we're asking people to leave. People that come in, they can't, conform to the system. They don't learn their jobs. They don't follow basic work practices of showing up to work on time and being a cooperative employee and learning their tasks. So there's a percentage of that turnover, that is created by us, and that goes really to a big issue of how do we attract people? How do we become recognized in this region as an employer of choice? And that's a challenge that, again, in public works, I see a constant need for employees. I see what Dwayne Jones is going through right now in Parks and Rec, where he's got to staff up for his spring, summer, fall maintenance. And he needs 14 or 16 seasonal people to do that. So we've been running ads on the internet and on radio stations, and we've gotten 2 or 3 nibbles. And, we sit here realizing that the contractors we deal with aren't doing a heck of a lot better, and so what is it that you can do as a locality, as an employer in the region generally, is a challenge that we have to face.
Do we have a statistic on the employees that leave our employment related to when they have to be drug tested?
Well, we certainly keep that. That's obviously on any individual confidential.
But I'm not asking for specific, but as overall, is that part of our problem?
I wouldn't say it's big. We definitely have, I can think, because those types of dismissals will come to our desk, and that's not a big part of loss in the work group. I think there was a period of time, and I'm going back now to the early days in my tenure, where it became very clear that the administration wasn't going to tolerate drug use in the organization, and we lost several people in sort of a fell swoop. You realize that in some positions we have random drug testing. Anybody who has a CDL license, certain public safety personnel are subject to random drug testing. I would say it's probably a bigger problem in attracting people. And I hear this from folks that are in the contracting world. I was talking to somebody that just retired from VDOT and said, they were talking to a couple of big contractors, guys, and saying, love to get on somewhere more steady. Well, City of Waynesboro and Stanton are hiring, and the response was, well, but they drug test. And so, I hear this, not only from, local government, but I hear it even in the private sector that, more and more people struggle to pass a drug test. But no, I wouldn't say that these numbers are driven by, random drug test. Or, if somebody in our organization, has a motor vehicle accident, backs into something, then they're going to go be sent for a drug test. And, so there are reasons that we, send folks to drug testing, and we definitely lose some people, but it's not driving these numbers.
Just to repeat, I think you said it at the beginning that it's just sort of an industry standard, if you will, 5-10% is what you would expect an organization to sort of experience in turnover, and anything above 10, you generally sort of that's where you want to
cause for concern. Yes,
raise some yellow flags. Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, I'm at a point that we could take a quick break if you want. I see it's 10:30. Do you want to take a couple of minutes?
Please, that'd be good.
Yeah. We'll come back and talk about where our money comes from. we spent a lot of time talking about how we can spend the money. Now the question of where's the money going to come from? So bearing in mind that a little more than 3/4 of the funds that we have available to us have to be generated locally. The state sends us a contribution less than 20%, and then other sources, the biggest one is the contribution we're getting from the buy-in at the Middle River Regional Jail, but we get donations and some proceeds from insurance and things like that. But for the most part, whatever we do, we're going to have to generate the money ourselves. And in terms of what those funding sources are, that general property taxes comprise the biggest portion of our revenues. And the general property taxes include real estate, personal property, motor vehicles, machinery and tools. Other local sales and use taxes would include things like the meals, lodging, sales tax, cigarette taxes, and then we have other smaller sources of revenue that are fee-based, that court-based, that provide us revenues, or that are the utility taxes, that sort of thing. We reflect 0% of federal revenues, even though we know that we will receive entitlement grant funds. However, because we operate on the modified accrual system of accounting in the general fund, we don't reflect the receipt of those revenues in the budget. We appropriate them when we receive them, and so we don't reflect the expenditures either. We do have a budget for those. It's held by the federal government. As we look at just the local revenues, then, by type, real property taxes account for about 40% of the city's revenues, and that is the real estate tax. Then, we receive about 18% from other miscellaneous taxes, which would be, in this case, would be meals and lodging primarily. Sales tax accounts for about 14% of the budget. Personal property tax is about 10%. As you're looking at this is a trend of some of the major revenue sources over time, and so they're basically, they're cumulative. So this big blue area would represent the trends and volume that real estate taxes have contributed through the years. And as you can see, starting about 2010, coming out of the recession, real estate was really pretty flat, and then you'll see increases that come by virtue of tax rate increases, both the one that the council adopted in fiscal year 18 and the one Mr. Hamp is proposing. This thin line, and as I think some of you know, I'm colorblind, so I'm not sure what color it is. It might be orange or it might be green, but it's a thin line. It's what we receive from machineries and tools. And again, it is both fairly flat. It only moves because the total volume of revenue is moving based on the base of real estate. But it's worth noting that we receive a little more than $1 million a year in machinery and tools tax. And I think we still, in many cases, view ourselves as a manufacturing community. And the employment in manufacturing as a percentage of total employment is still a bit higher in Waynesboro than the state average. But there was a time 10 years, 15 years ago that machinery and tools was 5 times what it is today. And today we get about 2.5 times more revenue from the car tax, from taxing automobiles, than we get on manufacturing machinery and tools. And that's something to let set in, is that how do you reverse that? Because as I say, $1 million in machinery and tools tax, about $2.5 million from the motor vehicles tax. The next line up, and again, being colorblind, I think it's pink.
Right.
gray it is what we receive in sales tax. And sales tax, has had some growth, but in recent years, I think we've started to see a leveling off of sales tax. Sales tax is about $5 million a year for the city, which is a significant source of revenue. But we did not meet our projections for sales tax in fiscal year 17. And this year, it looks like we're fairly well close to being on target with sales tax revenue. But at least as an observer of sales tax growth over time, I would say that it feels like we're starting to reach some sort of a plateau in the growth of sales tax. Meals and lodging tax, somebody can help me out with the color there?
Yellow.
Yellow. I was going to say yellow. Meals and lodging has become nearly equivalent, about equivalent with sales tax, a $5 million source of revenue every year. But it has certainly grown. I mean, if you look at where we were in 2010, and you can see that the band widens, that the meals and lodging tax has continued to grow and exceed our expectations. Mr. Ham talked about new revenue effort, tax rate increases. To those of you at home, the real estate tax rate proposal that Mr. Ham has contained in his budget would be an increase of 6 cents per $100 of valuation. This year, 1 penny on the tax rate is equivalent to a little more than $175,000. And so that would generate just more than $1 million in additional revenue for the city. The meals tax is proposed to increase by 1% from its current 6% to 7%, which would generate about $685,000, almost $686,000. And then the cigarette tax is proposed to increase from 20 to 30 cents per pack, which would generate an additional $165,226. So, in sum, the increase in from new revenue effort would be about $1.9 million. Now, if you were keeping score, when we went through all of the departments, those increases were well over $2 million. $1 million for schools, about $800,000 for public safety, about $600,000 for public works, and then more than about $300,000 for other things. So, but several things are going on. One is a contribution from fund balance. Two is that there are decreases elsewhere in the budget in expenditures. The most notable is we paid off a big economic development incentive that gives us about $300,000 of relief. And then conversely, on the revenue side, we've had a big drop, about a $200,000 drop in personal property tax collections.
Mr. Shaw, on like our cigarette tax, when's the last time we had an increase in that?
More than 10 years ago. That I recall in 2012 or so, I think we talked about doing it, and we did not. But we've not done it since you and I participated in this.
Because I remember at one time there was talk about the increase, and
right.
It would drive people from buying cigarettes in Waynesboro and they'd go outside of our jurisdiction. And I just wondered if we had any real feel for.
Well, I'm going to get to what the rates are in other jurisdictions, so we can take a look at that. So again, the current real estate tax rate is 87 cents per 100. Mr. Ham's proposing we would go up 6 cents to 93 cents per 100. Currently, the unweighted average of real estate tax among Virginia cities, the 38 cities, is $1.03. The median is just a few cents higher than that, maybe $1.06 or so. So we are still fairly well on the low side in comparison to other Virginia cities. And as Mr. Hamp says, we will have moved ourselves from about the 5th or 6th lowest up to about the 8th lowest currently.
How much, have you estimated how much it would cost a taxpayer, let's say, with a,
Yes,
if
I
that
have.
tax
Yeah,
rate?
I'll keep, let me continue.
Okay.
So the median, according to the Census Bureau, the median housing value in Waynesboro is $158,800. And so the tax rate increase for that homeowner would be an increase of $96 per year. Simple math is that it would be about $60 per year per $100,000 of value. So in other words, the increase for a $100,000 home would be $60,000. For a $200,000 home, $120 a year. I'm sorry, $60, $120 a year. And if you had a $300,000 home, the increase would be about $180 a year. Likewise, if you had a $1 million home, it would be about $600 a year. Or business. In comparing where we are with meals tax to other Virginia cities and counties, you'll note that there's a fair spread with cities, some as low as 3 to 4%, about 5 Virginia cities, some in the 4 to 5 cent, but most are clustered in this 5 to 6 cents percentage as percentage of meal sale to 10 Virginia cities that are in the 6 to 7. I think Stanton went to 7% last year. Charlottesville is, I think, at 5. Harrisonburg went to 6.5. So as you look around the region, going to 7% puts us, we're edging towards one of the higher communities, not outrageously so, but that 1% generates, again, about $700,000 in new revenue. Now, to Mr. Marks's question, the impact then is 1%. So if you buy lunch that's $7.95, your lunch is going to go up by about 8 cents. Family went out and had a dinner and it was $50, then you're going to pay an additional 50 cents for that dinner. So it's basically 1%. To Mr. Allen's question, cigarettes, there's certainly something to be said that if prices increase, then people either adjust their spending habits or seek a lower price for something, except for convenience. And then, and that can be a mitigating factor to some extent. So in other words, when you are talking about basic convenience items that that factors into how far do I have to travel to save a couple of cents on whatever the item is. So as you look at Virginia localities, counties often don't tax cigarettes at all. Augusta County doesn't have a cigarette tax. And among cities, we're sitting down here in this 16 to 30 cents, but you'll see more frequently cities are taxing somewhere in the 30 to 45, 46 to 60, or even over 60 cents per pack. There's a fair number of communities that do that. And the median among Virginia cities right now is 35 cents. And even among counties that do levy a cigarette tax, the median is about 30 cents. So I don't know I'm not a cigarette smoker. I don't know to what extent that additional 10 cents per pack would cause me to drive to someplace in Augusta County, Fishersville, or whatever. But my guess is if that's the case, those consumers are doing it now because they're paying 20 cents per pack in Waynesboro. So if that 20 cents is something that is of concern to that consumer, they're probably not buying their cigarettes in Augusta County now, or I'm sorry, in Waynesboro now. Again, increasing from 20 cents to 30 cents brings the city about $165,000 additional dollars. We've proposed that the use of fund balance in the general fund to amount to about $846,000, and then an additional $335,000 from the capital improvements fund, the undesignated capital fund. And I just provide this as a reminder that the City Council has adopted a fund balance policy, but we think through the legitimate uses of fund balance, and that fund balance is important to the financial health of the organization. It gives you some sort of a cushion, both in terms of unexpected expenditures, capital expenditures, as well as being able to smooth through a budget process. So in other words, that if you looked at having to come up with $1 million new dollars without being able to rely on a bank account, then your revenues would rise and fall depending on your capital replacement. As well, it provides you, some ability to make appropriations throughout the budget year without having to generate additional revenue. The detail of the use of fund balance is contained on page 8.1 of the document under the heading Use of Fund Balance. And you'll note that for the most part, fund balance is being used either from the VDOT restricted funds, $230,000, which are to make a purchase of a truck for the new concrete crew, and then $180,000 that would go to the Main Street Delphine intersection. That isn't the total cost of the intersection, it's just the additional funds that would be required in FY19. And then there are funds that would come from the general equipment reserve, about $260,000 for 3 new police cars, a vehicle for Parks and Rec with a snowplow, a utility vehicle for Parks and Rec with a snowplow. I think you may realize that the truck has utility to the organization year-round, but Parks and Rec also clears snow in our parking lots and the sidewalks around the Gorsuch building, this building, Rosenwall, and other city facilities. A tandem trailer for the cemetery, $2,000, and then a portion of the breathing apparatus for the fire department, $57,000, almost $58,000. The other portion of the breathing apparatus would come from the capital replacement fund, the undesignated capital. And then also in undesignated capital, we're proposing to use funds for the gas remediation project we discussed at the landfill. In the governmental facilities fund, we have a small amount of money for building renovations. We're still looking to expand and house folks in the community development departments. Small amount of money, $15,000 for the retaining wall at the Plum House. Again, we're looking to try to match those dollars with another source. Outdoor cooling tower at the Gorsuch building, $121,000. Restrooms at the Loth Trailhead, $30,000. Replacement doors at the swimming pool, $25,000. That if you go out there and look, that there are metal doors at the swimming pool that have begun to rust and deteriorate, and I think at a certain point become something of a safety hazard. And then $68,000 to replace the ephes, that's the exterior coating on the Rosenwall building. We have almost $90,000 of expenditures that would essentially come from the technology reserve. A portion of that would be for CAMA software, that's a computer-aided mass appraisal system that is being replaced in the tax assessor's office, and then a small amount for thermal printers and scanners for police department vehicles. That we're being pushed by the courts to go to being able to e-ticket, so that you can print a ticket for the court right in your police patrol car, and so that would provide a portion of the software or the hardware that would be required for that. We've talked a lot about the general fund, but in the water fund,
Mr. Shaw, before you get there, if you could, related to the fund balance, could you provide us with obviously not this moment, but a projected balance sheet of the reserve fund post, assuming nothing were to change and the budget were adopted? That would be helpful. Particularly where I'm kind of going with this is that what happens if our fund balance at the end of the year is not as healthy as we would hope?
Right.
And what are the consequences to the fund balance that we're liquidating as part of this?
Well, I can give you kind of a brief summary. The numbers won't be exact, but in our effort in the governmental equipment replacement and facility replacement is to come out of the budget process with reserves in the neighborhood of about $200,000 to $250,000, which just over a period of time, the previous finance director and I found that was a healthy cushion to be able to take us then through the fiscal year. And we're at about those numbers, and I'll get you exact numbers. This will almost liquidate the technology reserve. Technology reserve was originally established for the replacement of the citywide financial systems. And and then we've subsequently used it for capital costs, but and replacing servers and things of that nature. So that reserve will be just about liquidated. The undesignated capital reserve we set up last year, following, I guess it was FY16's CAFR, that we had not had an undesignated capital reserve prior to that, and we established it originally at $700,000. We added about $300,000, so it's at about $1 million prior to adoption of this budget, if you choose to do that. So, but again, I can give you a more exact rendering.
Okay. Thank you.
In the enterprise funds, we project some increase in the water fund, 4.1%, that we are requesting a fee increase of about 3.1% based on the rate study that was done last year. And as a reminder, part of the objective of the rate study, one was to be able to figure out what rates would need to be over a 5-year period to create a pay-as-you-go system in these enterprises so that capital projects, capital replacement, and operations could be paid for without having to borrow money, which would be unusual, especially in the sewer fund, where the course of the I&I projects over the years that we've been engaged in compliance with the consent order had been that we were very much debt dependent. Another thing that we wanted to accomplish was really stabilizing the retained earnings in those funds so that we could buffer ourselves against some sort of unforeseen capital, or allow that you had capital that you could work with either at budget time or through the year for large expenditures like the replacement of equipment or the radio read project that we've undertaken. And then as well, we wanted to ensure, obviously, that the rates were competitive with the jurisdictions close to us, and provided sufficient operating funds for labor and materials, so things that would not be considered capital. So the water fund would go up by 4.1% is a total. Some of that is the increase related to these folks being eligible also for merit increases. Part of it is the use of some retained earnings, about $150,000, to do the final phase of the radio read meter replacement upgrade program. In the water fund, there's also a request for an in-house meter reader, customer service representative. In recent years, we've farmed some of that duty out. We would like to bring it back. And then, as I mentioned, the use of retained earnings about $69,000, which contributes towards the $150,000 that's needed for the meter reading system. In the sewer fund, we continue to complete I&I projects with the use of surplus bond proceeds. You may recall that a couple of years ago, the council moved some funds that had been borrowed for building a pump station in the Oak Hill area, and we used those to complete I&I projects, which we coordinate with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. We also have to generate a certain rate in the sewer fund to conform with a bond covenant that requires that net revenues exceed debt service expenses by 15% for any given year. We're looking to replace a SCADA system. I don't recall what the acronym stands for, but it's basically a system that allows it various pump stations and the sewage treatment plant communicate with one another, so we understand where flows are through the system. And then a camera truck, which I think you're well aware that we use a camera to examine the condition of our sewer systems, both for short-term maintenance projects and sewer blockages and that sort of things, as well as long-term evaluation of the system. We had also budgeted to spend $150,000 from the sewer fund for their share of the meter reading system. That we base our sewer fees on the water usage of the consumer, and so that cost would be split. And this does allow that we would make a transfer of $250,000 to retained earnings in the sewer fund. And as you may recall, one of the issues that we talked about when we went through the rate study was that we needed to improve the retained earnings in the sewer fund. It's a very capital intensive and debt burdened fund, and there's good reason to build the retained earnings of that fund.
The camera truck, I mean, $250,000 for that asset is just astonishing. Mm-hmm. I mean, does every community sort of that provide water sewer services? I mean, are there any opportunities to share that resource? I can't imagine that Stanton or Harrisonburg is dropping $250,000 every few years for a new truck.
I don't think you do it every few years. This is the first
I was
one.
being
I think in 10 years this is the first one I've seen. I would say to you, if they're a community of even close to our size, yes, that the camera truck could be called out on a daily basis when you have sewer blockages and you're trying to make some determination of, is it the homeowner's problem or is it the city's problem, and just what is the nature of the problem. And so we use a camera truck, on a fairly regular basis just to do the routine maintenance. Where is the problem? And then the camera can track not only, it can show you within the sewer pipe itself whether the blockage occurs from something that's gotten stuck in the system or there's a more problematic break in the system, that roots have intruded and those kinds of things. And then also tells you essentially where it is, and you can track where the camera is in the system so that you can start digging in the right spot. You don't have to just start from a property line. And then also it tells us, is it the homeowner's responsibility or is it the city's responsibility? So we use it on, for those reasons, and then as well, that footage has been used to do larger evaluations of the condition of the system, and it really is proven invaluable in being able to target what are very expensive I&I projects, that you can go in and evaluate the entire length of pipes within these drainage systems to determine, do you have a problem that can be rectified if the flows work by lining a pipe in place, or are you going to have to tear the pipe up for a complete replacement? And so my sense is that for Harrisonburg or Stanton, that they would have this equipment as well, and that it's not easily shared. A flush truck is about $250,000. A street sweeper, maybe not quite that much. I mean, these are expensive pieces of equipment.
Mr. Shaw, under the water fund, when you talk about having our meter readers, and we're going forward with the radio reader system,
Right.
Don't we contract out to people now to read?
We do have one person that we contract now, and so the person also has to run cutoffs. I mean, this is part of a challenge we have.
Is this our contract person?
Correct,
Okay.
correct. And we do some of it in-house, but the challenge that you have, we run cutoffs on regularly as the various billing route cycles come up. In other words, as we read meters, not everybody gets their bill at the same time. That you have various 15 routes or so through the city, and so those routes are have different bill dates. And so then, as we come to the due date, and then if somebody has not paid by a certain time beyond the due date, that they're on a cutoff list, and that we've sent them notice that if they don't pay, then we're going to cut their water off. That's our recourse, that we won't continue to provide free water. But we can't run a complete cutoff list. That we end up with more people on a cutoff list than we have manpower to cut off and then turn back on, because what happens is you have people that get their water cut off, they run in to make payment, and then we say, we'll get back out that day to cut your water back on. And if you paid us in time, but we don't end up with that sufficient manpower to ever run a complete cutoff list. And so beyond meter reading, the bigger press tends to be running cutoffs. And so we talk about some equity, and generally you look at your cutoff list, and the people that owe you the most are who we're going to cut off first. But that at what point in time is it fair to say, well, some people ended up without water and some people didn't, even though they were all on a cutoff list. So there's some of that. Now, I would say to you, and we're going through the Munis, it's the software system that we use for all of our financials and including utility billing, that we hear a lot of things from folks that say, why don't you charge extra for coming out at night, having to check meters? I mean, that's another part of it. People call and they say, I don't believe that what you've billed me. Well, we send this guy out to check the meter, and we have a little test that we can take a certain volume of water and pour it through the meter and stand there and see if it works. But there are a lot of localities that say, we think our meters work, and if you want us to come do those tests, you get billed for that. And that I think we provide good service, and we're pretty lenient to folks who challenge their bills or don't pay their bills. So this person really deals as much or more with those kinds of things than they do reading meters. And I think there are some localities, many localities, according to our consultants, who try to recapture those costs. That if somebody pays their bill and it's at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, right before closing time here, there are a lot of localities that say, well, if you want us to come out after our man is off his shift, you have to pay for that. You have to pay extra for that. And Augusta County does that. If you want us to come out and check your meter, you have to pay for that. Now that's not going to recover probably the entire cost here, because what you really hope happens is that people change their habits and pay their bills on time, and they realize we have a metered system. And I got early in this position, I used to try to walk through, well, how could you have used the water? I don't know. Did you have visitors? Do you have a kiddie pool you filled up? Do you have a garden? And after a point, I realized that's a fruitless endeavor, because people never think they used the water they used. And I just got to the point where I said, we have a metered system. I don't know what happened on your side of the meter. I just know what the meter read. And if our meter's working, that's what the bill is.
If we go to the radio readout and we would hire another meter reader that would be a full-time employee for us, or would it be a contractor?
No, this would be a full-time
Would we still
in-house.
keep the contractor?
No, I think we would move ourselves away from the contract service.
So would there not be a cost savings if we got rid of that person?
Yeah, it's an offset,
and
yes.
we're putting in
Ultimately.
more money into the budget, for the new person. Would that not
Yes.
be a wash, or?
Ultimately, it will be a wash. I mean, we will move ourselves to that system.
I just wonder why it would show up in the budget then if it's going to be a wash.
Well, it won't be a wash immediately. I mean, like I say, we can't keep up with cutoffs as they are now. And that's really, it's more about cutoffs than it is meter reading.
Well, I would think, I had my cable go out and I called and they said, well, we can't get there until 2 days from now. So that's what, because of the amount of customer service calls they
Right.
had. I think if I waited to the last minute to pay my bill, or it got to be to the cutoff point, I wouldn't expect the city to come out 15 minutes after I paid it to cut it back on. I think it'd be, you're on a waiting list to get cut back on, and that's when you go get it.
You would think that would be the way people think, and yet...
No, I wouldn't think that at all. And,
It's not.
Not at all. But am I hearing right that we don't charge for these kinds of?
We do charge for, there is a penalty for having us cut your water off. We don't call it a cut on or cut off fee, but there's a charge for having gotten yourself to that point. So yes, we're billing people. I mean, it would be, it's like many things, whether it's the use of credit cards or whatever, it's a lot cheaper for folks to manage their resources and pay the bill, because it costs them penalties and interest and all sorts of things to end up at that point. But we have cutoff lists that you're always over 100 folks. The impact then for any particular water user, sewer user, the 3.1% water rate increase, that's both on the base fee and the consumption fee, and 2.4% sewer rate increase, again, both base and consumption. The change that a typical residential user, if you've got a family of 5, you're probably using more than 10,000 gallons per day. If you've got 1 or 2 folks in the household and they're particularly frugal with their use of water, they're probably using less than 10,000 gallons of water in their bi-monthly bill. But the bill itself, again, a bi-monthly bill, on average would go up about $4.89. And for this particular residential user, the total change per year would be $29.34. It's about $30 a year difference for the typical residential customer.
You have a comparison with us and other jurisdictions as far as costs for these services?
I don't have it prepared today, but we keep edging with the Augusta County Service Authority. That's the folks we look at most closely. They bill the same way we do. And they're about where we are. We might edge ahead of them a little bit with these increases, but then it seems like they soon edge ahead of us, then we edge ahead of them, and vice versa. So we're pretty comparable with the Augusta County Service Authority. Stanton bills in a different way. They bill by cubic feet, and they're a little harder to evaluate, and then also Augusta County deals with all of their sewer, but I would say that they're comparable. We go in and look at a dashboard that there's an engineering company does for the Commonwealth, and I would say in sewer fees, we're edging a little beyond the median. Water fees, we're still a little below the median, but I would say that we're somewhere in the middle across the Commonwealth, and then about comparable with Augusta County and Stanton. But I can get those numbers for you.
Well, comparatively to in Stanton, I mean, they've, if I recall correctly, they've got some water and sewer production things to deal with over the next 10 years too, that we're already,
right.
we already have a facility.
Exactly. I think they do river skimming still, and that's getting to be a more and more complicated venture. We're very fortunate here to have the water resources we do. I think the other thing is that the comparisons are good to do, and we did part of that during the rate study. But you also have to run the system that you have. It doesn't really matter at a certain point. And it's, in fact, in many ways, it's peculiar and extraordinary that Augusta County's rates would be like ours because their system is so much different. They have this very dispersed system with multiple plants and multiple water resources and these small self-contained systems. It's their business model is so different that it's extraordinary that our rates, and to some extent just by coincidence, that our rates are what they are. But we took tremendous hits in having, coming under consent order, having to build a sewage treatment plant, having to do the I&I work we've done. We're tens of millions of dollars that we take on in debt service in a fairly short time in the sewer fund, and then with the water side, we really delayed having to build a filtration plant for a number of years. That anybody that had springs in Virginia, and we have our primary water source is Corner Springs. It's about 2/3 of our water. But folks that had springs fell under a designation that said those waters are under the influence of surface water. And so there was a big push, golly Ned, in the 90s to put those springs onto filtration. And we had a particularly pure source and flew under the radar, under the regulation for quite some time, but then in 2010 had to bring a $10 million plant online. So both funds, part of what you're paying for is the facility that's already in place, the cost of that facility, and your access as the consumer to that capital facility, and part of what you're paying for is just what it takes us to operate, to run a plant, to run the 2 plants, and to have guys that will go out and fix lines as they break and make repairs and keep the system running.
Ms. Charlotte, I just want to point out that I think sometimes we get accustomed to the water we have, and it makes them very proud to have the best water in the state. And we forget that and have a tendency to take it for granted sometimes. And if you travel around, even in local areas or just across the mountain, water tastes a lot different than our water does. And I think we can appreciate that. We look at the cost of some of these having them, but to have them means a lot.
Well, we do. We have an exceptional water resource. We have an exceptional, actually, the operation of both the water and the sewer funds. The top priority is meeting regulatory compliance. Providing clean, safe water, is the top priority, and then protecting the environment in the discharge of wastewater is the top priority. And we've done an exceptional job in both regards in terms of regulatory compliance. But I agree with you. We continue to win various awards on water tasting, which people think water's water, but if you travel around a bit, you realize no, some of it doesn't taste as good as it does here in Waynesboro. Well, Mr. Mayor, this brings us to the conclusion of the presentation as I prepared it. As I said, we're happy to go through the budget in as much detail as you desire. We're glad to do a departmental review. I don't know that that's necessary or the best use of your time, but we will certainly do what you ask us to do. Beyond that, I think we have a work session scheduled for Wednesday. This morning, any questions that you have, comments that you'd like to make, discussion, Mr. Hamp and I are done, so it's on you guys.
Well, I know we've covered a lot of ground this morning. I personally would probably like to go home, go over what we've discussed this morning and try to digest some of it and think of other questions that I might have and come back if that's what we'd like to do as a group here.
That's what I'd like to do.
So I think we're good then, and see you again on Wednesday at 5 o'clock.
Wednesday at 5 o'clock.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
recommend Kevlar on Wednesday night.
We have a new